Welcome to our webinar. I see many of you are coming into the room, so thank you for being here and welcome. I just want to say how happy we are to have you today, and we're very happy to have Howard Friedman as our special guest today. If you would like to ask questions during the presentation, please do so in the Q&A located at the bottom of the Zoom webinar screen. It says Q&A. There is no chat available, so that is the way to communicate with our speaker. So it is my pleasure to introduce Howard. He's a data scientist and a health economist, writer and artist. He teaches at Columbia University and has decades of experience in the public sector, private sector, and academia. Friedman earned a master's in statistics and a PhD in biomedical engineering from Johns Hopkins University. He took a position as a director at Capital One, where he led teams of data scientists, statisticians, analysts, and programmers in various areas of operations and marketing. He later formed private companies that provided consulting services in areas of designing, developing, and modeling data, as well as led analytics projects in the public sector. He's authored or co-authored about 100 scientific articles and book chapters in areas of data science, applied statistics, health economics, and politics. In June 2012, Prometheus Books released his book, Measure of a Nation. This book focuses on how to improve America by first comparing its performance with 13 competitive industrial nations, then identifying the best practices found throughout the world that can be adopted here in the US. Measure of a Nation was named by Jared Diamond as the best book of 2012 in an interview published by the New York Times. His most recent release, which we'll discuss today, is called Ultimate Price. It has been covered by major media, including National Public Radio and the Journal of Science, and is being translated into a number of foreign languages. So we are very pleased and very lucky to have Howard here today. So with that, I will turn the program over to Howard. Again, if you have any questions for Howard, please place them in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and enjoy. Howard?
Thank you very much. Well, it is a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate that kind introduction. For today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give a book presentation. It'll be maybe 25, 30 minutes long. And then after that, I'll go straight over to the Q&A section, and we'll just kind of talk through some of the questions that you post. So truly, the more you can make this interactive, the better. With that in mind, I'm going to start by talking about Ultimate Price, the value we place on life, which, as Jamie mentioned, was released just a few months ago. And there's a lot of interesting media coverage around it. A lot of it due to some of the issues it brings up that a lot of people haven't thought about before. And we'll get into a little bit more later, but a lot of my purpose in the book is to raise people's awareness about the fact that price tags, dollar figures, are put on human life nearly at all times. It's quite ubiquitous. These price tags are quite important. They're also often very unfair in that they value some lives much, much more than others in a very unjust way. And if we identify this situation, a situation where it is unjust, we should try to do something about it. So that's the basic principles behind the book itself. With that in mind, I'll start with a basic statement, which is all lives are precious, but they're not priceless. And it seems very cruel to talk about human life in dollar figures, but the reality is this is how the world works. I take a very pragmatic approach to thinking about how human life is valued. And what I try to do is recognize that in the real world, price tags are put on human life regularly. They're put on human life by arbitrators. So in a civil court case, maybe an arbitrator is making a decision about an accidental death, for example. Regulators, as part of their regular job function, incorporate cost-benefit analysis in their work. When they do that, they look at what is the costs associated with, let's say, making drinking water safer, or making the factories produce less pollutants so that there's less respiratory diseases. And the benefits are measured in the lives saved, the dollar figures associated with those human lives. So the idea of cost-benefit analysis and monetizing human life is central to the work of regulators. Statisticians and analysts do this in many different areas. In for-profit companies, if they're producing a product that can cause injury or death, then there are people doing calculations, trying to figure out how much should they invest in safety versus what is the corresponding costs associated with how much they would have to pay in settlements, lawsuits, and fines for preventable deaths if they made a decision to not make their product safer. Of course, actuaries, as part of applying analysis to life insurance policies, are constantly looking at life and how it's valued and people making decisions in that respect. And many economists use this as part of their toolkit regularly. So the point being that price tags really are something that we see in many areas of human life. We just often don't think about them. The price tags are often unfair, and we'll talk a little bit about the unfairness. The unfairness can be driven by many different factors. In my analysis, a lot of the unfairness is driven by situations where the price tag is based on income, where income itself has a lot of inequalities that we're all well aware of. Gender-based wage gaps, race-based wage gaps, location-based wage gaps, age-based wage gaps. They all play a role in inequalities in wages. And if you're using income as a basis for valuing life, then you have these inequalities that are already baked into your system, baked into the equations. I first got interested in how human life is valued after September 11th. There was a victims' compensation fund that had been created. It used government money, and that victims' compensation fund was administered by Kenneth Feinberg. Special Master Feinberg was given some constraints. When he was put in charge, the directions from the Congress specifically said that he had to consider economic impact. And so he created a formula. The formula was fairly complicated. It had a minimum value. No matter who you are, at least your life was valued at $250,000. There were inputs to the calculation. For each dependent that died of the victim, there was an additional $250,000. Income was a major driving factor in the calculation, but he capped the income. If you are earning over a certain amount, about $220,000, he said he will assume that you did not earn any more than that amount. He capped it. And then he subtracted factors from it. He subtracted things such as if you had life insurance. The end of this calculation produced awards to the families of the victims. Some people got paid $250,000. The families of other victims got paid over $7 million. And in fact, the largest payout was not for a death, but for an injury, nearly $8 million. This was not broadly accepted. The public generally was not very pleased with this huge inequality, this huge range in compensation. And many asked, why was the death of some people worth 30 times more than others? After all, this was government money being spent. Well, I alluded to it already, and the answer is income. In the many factors that were used in that calculation, income dominated. And those who are earning less were deemed to be less valuable than the higher earners. The scale of income can be enormous. That's something that we see here in the United States. But when you just use income, it has problems. Why? Because income itself is known to have substantial biases, gender-based biases. So there's different calculations that have been done, but irrespective of the calculation, it's fairly well established that comparing men and women of the same educational background, same experience, women on average will be paid less. So if you just base it on income, then women are being unfairly assessed in terms of their value of life. Race has substantial gaps. Comparing Black and white Americans, there's an income gap of about 25%, whether both have high school degrees, college degrees, or graduate degrees. Age and location also have their own biases. So if you're using income, by definition, these biases are playing into how much you value that human life. And then you get the extreme values. When I look at equations, I ask myself, what happens in the extreme? And in the extreme of using income as a way to value human life, you would draw a conclusion that one successful hedge fund manager would be worth hundreds of other lives, whether they're, here I list police, teachers, social workers, soldiers, nurses, other people who are performing valuable work to society would be identified as being worth just a small fraction. Intuitively, this just doesn't seem to make sense. It feels unjust. I mentioned this, but it's worth really emphasizing. The income range in the United States is enormous. So when you use income as a way to estimate how much a human life is worth, you're using a value that has a tremendous range. And the United States is very unusual compared to other developed wealthy countries. Other wealthy countries don't have this range. Their bottom, that minimum wage, is higher, and their top, the post-tax income of the wealthiest, is lower. So the United States really is an extreme outlier in terms of income range. And when income range is used to value human life, that means we will generate much wider ranges than other countries. To give you a feel for how enormous this range is, if we were earning minimum wage, working a regular 40-hour week, you'd earn around $15,000 a year. Meanwhile, every year, leaders in the financial industry can earn over $100 million. Different orders of magnitude. So again, if you're using income to estimate how much a human life is worth, you'll end up with a rather enormous disparity and a conclusion that a financial leader is worth 10,000 low-income workers. Well, certainly that doesn't make sense intuitively. Income itself is worth focusing on a little bit more because the US really is an outlier. CEOs in the United States get paid about 300 times more than the average worker. This range, this ratio is much, much higher than ratios seen in other countries. And it's much higher than historical US ratios. So what we see is that this compensation for the highest end of the United States really is unusual. Unusual in history for the United States and unusual globally today. There I was talking about putting dollar figures on human life, but we also have court systems. And the court systems are divided into criminal courts and civil courts. Civil courts focus on dollars. Financial compensation, whether it be for an injury, a death, or some other loss. The criminal system is looking to have society gain justice for an injury that has been incurred. Regardless, we state that justice is supposed to be blind. We have that wonderful figure of the justice with her eyes covered. Yet, the reality is courts routinely value some lives more than others. I'm going to talk about this Thurston versus State of New York case a little bit. Cheryl Thurston was severely handicapped. She was in a care facility with the specific instructions that she was not able to bathe herself. She had been left unattended during a bath. She slipped into a coma. Within 24 hours, she died. Her sister sued the care facility. In that particular case, the judge ended up determining that the care facility was negligent, that they, due to their failure, caused the death of Cheryl Thurston. Yet the judgment was for $0, nothing. And the judge specifically pointed out the issues in this. The judge pointing out that in New York State, there is no special provision for compensation for the loss of human life. Judge also pointed out that Cheryl Thurston was not earning an income. but rather she was costing money. And lastly, most importantly, the judge talked about how had Cheryl been chattel, like a cow or a chicken, then her sister could have been entitled to compensation. It's a stunning conclusion. And this is a recent case. Seventh anniversary was only a few months ago. So on one side, you have Cheryl Thurston. The legal system determines that her life is worth nothing, zero. On the other side, we take a very prominent case, Ronald Goldman and Nicole Brown. In the civil case, O.J. Simpson was found guilty, and the settlement was for $33.5 million. Their lives were worth an extreme amount of money. Now, what drove their life to be worth so much? Well, obviously the media was heavily involved. The wealth of the murderer was a consideration in California law. But there are other factors that clearly played a role as well. Different states have different laws, and that plays in also. But at its bottom line, we see just this massive disparity in how human life can be valued. And as I described in the New York State case, the judge said it is repugnant to the court to have to enforce a law which places no intrinsic value on human life. Now, this varies state to state, but most states do not actually have a law that puts a value on human life. There's a general principle that comes up time and time again, whether we're talking about civil courts, criminal courts, whether we're talking about judgments made in arbitration or any other aspect, in for-profit companies as well. Lives that are more valued are more protected, and lives that are less valued are less protected. If someone's life is deemed to be worth $10 million, then a company will invest more in safety than if that person's life is deemed to be worth $10,000. It makes a big difference. So, lives that are more valued are more protected. Let's talk about the criminal system for a second. Now, justice is supposed to be blind, but one thing that we have seen from the data very clearly is that the death penalty is more likely to be applied when the murder victims are white and the murderer is black. Race, in theory, should not be playing a role, yet the data shows that very clearly that it is. Lives that are less valued are less protected. Let's talk more about criminal cases. Vehicular manslaughter is a somewhat random process. You're driving a car, you get into an accident. You might hit a pedestrian, a bike rider, some other car, and someone dies. The victim is somewhat random. Justice should be blind, yet the jail sentences, on average, vary depending on the race, sex, and employment status of the victim. Why should it matter if you caused the death of someone when they were crossing a street, whether that person was well-employed or unemployed? Why should it matter what sex they are or what race? Justice clearly is not blind. I mentioned at the beginning that price tags are put on human life in all different aspects. And I talked a little bit about the legal system. We talked about compensation funds. But as was mentioned in the introduction, I have spent a lot of time in the private sector. And in the private sector, they constantly have to think about cost-benefit analysis. Financial calculations are done. And when you do these calculations, you weigh on one side, what is the cost of improving the safety of your device? Versus, on the other hand, what will you pay in lawsuits and fines for not improving, not preventing these possible risks and deaths? Many of us probably have heard of some classic cases, the Ford Pinto case or some of the other ones that are often taught in business schools, where a company could have invested in making their product more safe, but decided not to and paid a consequence later. For me, there's a calculation that happens, and it happens, once again, internal to companies, but there's also these softer aspects. I call it the brand of a company. where companies that do the right thing can get positive reputation and brand that lasts for many years. And companies that do the wrong thing, such as in the case of the Ford Pinto case, are used as textbook examples 50 years later. So there's a long-term implication there. There is this trade-off in the calculations about maximizing profits by balancing safety versus the value of human life. I'm going to take two examples to give you some extreme values. Union Carbide gas leak. In Bhopal, India, 1984, there was a terrible gas leak. About 4,000 people were killed. The images of this were all over the television. They're still seared very clearly in my brain of the people and suffering from this. Now, this happened many years ago in India. The compensation per victim was $60,000. I'll transport you to a much more recent situation. Just a few years ago, Toyota was well aware of issues with their acceleration system. It was well documented. Their engineers had reported it even before the cars had rolled out. They made a decision to not adjust, to not do a recall, to not correct. Now, in the United States, less than 100 people were killed due to this issue. The compensation to the victims plus the penalties that they had to pay to the regulators came out to about $20 billion per victim. This sends a message to other car companies as well, which is, this is the price you're going to pay if you choose to not invest in safety to prevent a knowing risk that could cause death. $20 million is a very heavy price to pay. That incents companies to invest far more in safety. At $60,000 per victim, companies are far less incented. Lives that are more valued are more protected. Lives that are less valued are less protected. There is a clear balance that goes on between safety and valuing life. And here we see it. Going forward, after that rather severe penalty and settlement with Toyota, I think we can expect to see car companies far more likely to invest in safety. Clearly, a message was meant to be sent. From my perspective, there are equations. I study equations, it's kind of my background. But I spend a lot of time in the book trying to explain how the equations work. Because I fundamentally believe that as you take the time to explain the assumptions, the inputs, and how the formulas are used for valuing life, that other people with different perspectives, they may find flaws in it. They may find limitations. They may find problems in it. And activists can help guide technical specialists on how to improve it. We need to ensure that life is priced fairly so human rights and human lives are protected. I already talked about how when income is used as an input, there's lots of problems because of the biases, whether it's related to gender, race, age, or location. But there are other approaches. Zuckerberg and Priscilla Chen, in their foundation, state, we believe all lives have equal value. The Gates Foundation states we see equal value in all lives. Now, it's easy to be cynical. It's easy to say, well, these are some of the richest people in the world, and from their perspective, they can make that statement, but they're not going to divide their wealth across the roughly 8 billion people in the world. A lot of their money is going to go to their family. Yes, of course. But this principle of equality is not impossible. And I want to focus on that for a minute, because the principle of equality, starting with equal value of life, is something that can be done. Eloquent words can be supported with concrete action. I mentioned earlier about the regulating industry. So regulatory agencies, whether it's the transportation, whether it's the Food and Drug Administration, whether it's the Environmental Protection Agency, they all value lives the same. whether you're rich or poor, older, young, black or white, male or female, all lives are valued at the same amount, roughly $10 million per life. This value is called the value of a statistical life, or VSL. This is a very clear expression of equality. So when you talk about putting a power plant and its pollutants, whether you place it in a neighborhood not too far from where wealthy people live, or a neighborhood not too far from where poor people live, from the point of view of the regulator, as they compute the impact of new safety laws, all lives are valued equally. We talked about the September 11th Victims Compensation Fund, and I mentioned that the person responsible was Special Administrator Kenneth Feinberg. He's managed a lot of these funds. He's an expert at this. He himself was displeased with the compensation structure that he came out with. Now, he was constrained. Congress said he had to consider economic impact of the loss of the victim. But he was bothered by the fact that there was this enormous range and that it was controversial. He himself said, way back in 2004, that it would have been fairer, easier to administer, and less controversial if he had just paid everyone the same amount of money. Well, that was his statement in 2004. He got the chance to redo things. After the Boston Marathon bombing, a fund was created. Now, this was with private money. There was no constraints placed on how he could disperse the money. What did he do? He did exactly what he said he thought should have been done. The families of those who died received the exact same amount of money, regardless of the victim's income, age, sex, race, or any other factor. He lived up to exactly what he said was the correction he wanted to make. And it kind of brings me back to my take-home point. From my perspective, when you're valuing human life, the starting point for valuing life should be equality and equity. Equality is about evenness. Equity is about fairness. Now, you'll probably see that's not a rock-solid conclusion. I'm hedging a little bit. I say the starting point. And the reason why I say the starting point is because equality is not a perfect answer, and I recognize that. I can't line up the Nobel Prize winner with the murderer and say that those lives should be protected equally. I can't do that. I recognize that it's not a perfect answer to say equality. But at the same time, I know that using income has huge, huge issues, huge inequalities, driven by the inequalities within the United States, the huge ranges in the United States, as well as all the biases. And so I would say going forward, if we start with the idea of valuing human life equally, and then if we need to make modifications, we can tweak it around the edges. So with that, I'm going to stop, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I notice we've got a few things in the Q&A already. So why don't I start by answering some of the questions, and then by all means, please put in more questions so we can continue to go that way. So first question I see is from Cheryl Adams. I'm wondering if businesses factor any ethical considerations when valuing people's lives and also protecting the company's reputational and other risks. Great question. So I can tell you when I have sat in on and doing these equations, how they work. And now that doesn't mean it's true for all companies, and sometimes companies do make an ethical decision that isn't the financial one. So I'm going to describe what I've done, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about when companies do specifically take into consideration ethics. So when I've done the calculations, we look specifically at what is the cost associated with the improvements in safety, what are the corresponding benefits associated with, and we line them up by line item, expected number of cases, cost per case via lawsuit, regulatory fine, reputational risk if we can quantify it, and that includes some estimate of brand. That's a calculation. There's a little bit of guesswork in it, but sometimes the government makes it easier for us. So think about that calculation and take that example that I just showed about Toyota, where the settlement came out to $20 million per preventable death. If I'm a car company, that's probably the number I'm putting in there for my cost per preventable death. And that's going to shift my equation substantially. But I want to talk about ethics for a second, because you brought it up, and it's a very important point. I think a lot about river blindness. So the context behind this is Merck had developed a cure for river blindness. They recognized that while they had identified this cure and they tested it, it was effective, that the population in need could not afford to pay it. They had choices, and this is going back decades. They could have tried to extract whatever was the maximum amount they could from the governments. They could have chosen to have a reduced price, but they went even further. They offered it for free, and they funded support to the distribution channels as well. Now, that was a decision which in the short term was not going to make them money. They were incurring expenses. They were not going to get revenue. But it built a lot. Internally, to this day, those programs are substantial motivators. This is much deeper than the superficial corporate social responsibility you see some companies do. It built into that company the idea that they're a science company who has a responsibility to help. People there are still proud of it, and it's still taught as a textbook example of corporate ethics. So sometimes people do make very clear, companies make very clear decisions, which in the short term may not seem like great financially, but if you increase your employee pride, perhaps that reduces your turnover, perhaps that makes it easier to recruit, and also it helps in your long-term brand. I'm gonna go to another question. So there's another question here. It says, how would I suggest we change how we legally value a lost life as per the disabled person case? So I guess the first thing is in the court system, we've got a criminal court and we have a civil court. For the criminal court system, I do fundamentally believe that justice should be blind. And what that means along with that is, in the examples that I gave, on average, premeditated murder is premeditated murder, regardless of who you killed. There shouldn't be these driving factors that are more or less predictive of the severity of the case and the punishment. Vehicular homicide is a fairly random event. There's no logical explanation for why the income of the individual should play a role in what is the punishment for the person who committed the crime. In the example of the civil courts, it does get a bit more challenging because different families will incur different losses if there's a different financial implication. And I think that if we go back and look at what is an equality starting point, we could look to have, once again, the settlements start with a fixed amount per life lost, and then people can argue against that for adjustments. For example, in the September 11 Victims Compensation Fund, Kenneth Feinberg made an offer to each family, and the family could challenge that offer. They could go back and try to renegotiate it. So I think these are starting points, not necessarily finished points. But you raise another question in that question as well, which is about people who die versus people who are permanently injured, unable to work. As I mentioned, in the September 11 Victims Compensation Fund, the largest payout was not to the family of someone who died, but to someone who was injured. And the reason why was that individual was going to require full-time care for the rest of their life. They were also going to be unable to work for the rest of their life. So they had lost income as well as care expenses. It was questionable why that number came out higher than the highest payout. And I think it comes down to the fact that the minimum value of life that Ken Feinberg used was $250,000, which, to his benefit, in credit, many legal systems have no minimum. We saw that in the Cheryl Thurston case where the minimum was $0. But our regulatory agencies put a value of $10 million, not $250,000. So had he used a much higher minimum value of life, then I think in that particular case, the highest payout would still have been for a death, not an injury. So it came down to, in his equation, he used a non-zero value, but a relatively low value for the minimum value. There's another question of, is the income value explicitly about future earnings or talent, imagining future? It's a great question. Usually not, but, and here's the but. In situations of minors or those who have not become of age of working, maybe they're still in school, usually when they do an income-based calculation, they project it based on what was the projected earnings of that individual. If it's someone who is already, such as myself, mid-career, they don't assume that Howard Friedman is going to have a fantastic growth curve in his income over the next 20 years. You're assumed to follow the typical trajectory of earnings. They don't make an adjustment for Howard's special talent. Going back again to the September 11th Victims Compensation Fund, the minors who died on September 11th, the families of those victims all were paid the same amount of money. So interestingly, even in the September 11th Victims Compensation Fund, there was a measure of equality. It was just for all the minors who died. So those below 18. So I do think, though, that once you open up the conversation on talent, then all of the measures that we do for talent can have their own biases as well. So it becomes a little bit problematic. Let me scroll down a little bit. Boy, I read the questions wrong at first, and I thought, oh, I guess I'm all done. And then I noticed, boy, there's a lot more. So I'm excited. Okay, I'm just going to read them in order if you don't mind. And if I come across one that stumps me, that's my fault, right? I see another one here. If all lives have equal value, what guidance would you give to medical professionals who have limited resources to treat COVID victims, assuming the patients differ in nothing but age? Oh, that was a good one. So let me describe what some states did, because I think this is what you're alluding to. I live in New York State, and New York City in particular. So we had a very rough time period, certainly March, April, May, where there was concerns and some of the hospitals were out of ventilators. Massachusetts also had a rough stretch in the Boston area, a few areas. So some states issued guidance, not rules, but guidance, that suggested that if a hospital has to choose, if you're out of ventilators, you have to choose whose life will you try to ventilate. And remember, ventilators had a very, very low rate. If you went on ventilators, the probability of mortality is extremely high still. Most of the states provided guidance saying, consider age, survival probability, comorbidities. So those were the factors that many of the states were guiding on. To my own perspective, I think if a choice has to be made, I think survival probability, which is linked to age, comorbidities, is probably the choice that I would be making too. Once again, better planning and we don't have to make those choices, but it's basically a little bit of the trolley car problem. And I'll describe that for a second. Trolley car runaway train problem is a classic ethics problem where you've got a runaway train It's going down one track. If it continues down that one track, it'll kill, let's say, 5 people. You control the switch. If you flip the switch, it'll hit one person and kill one person. Do you flip the switch? Most people will say yes. You say, well, I'm killing one person by saving 5. But then this decision becomes far more problematic when you start adding in information about who are the people. Those 5 people are all convicted murderers. And that one person is the Nobel Peace Prize winner. Do I run over the 5 murderers? So identification bias starts coming in. As I add in more information, it changes people's perspectives. Do I know the individual? Is that a family member? So I think that most states issue those types of advisories, but it's very important to note that the Affordable Care Act, which provides funding for many of these hospitals, specifically states that you cannot prioritize services based on age or comorbidity or survival probability. This was a ramification of a lot of the concerns about death panels back in the during the deliberations. So there are federal restrictions on how some resources can be allocated, and you have state advisories that have been issued providing guidance that focuses on providing, in a choice to those who are younger and healthier. So since we picked up on COVID, let's run with COVID a little bit more. For many people, the COVID pandemic has touched them personally. For myself, I've known people who got very sick. I actually know someone who died. And so it's not a theoretical concept. I mean, I'm living it. And for COVID, there are some frameworks that we have to think about. One of them, in terms of valuing human life, is who is most impacted health-wise, who is most exposed. Here in New York, there was no question that people who were of lower income groups were far more exposed. That correlated very strongly with different minority groups. There's no question. The data shows that very clearly in New York. Who was impacted the most economically? So if you weren't impacted health-wise, economically, it was people who had to do on-site labor, right? My work continues via Zoom, remote. I'm lucky. I'm in a privileged class where my income was not impacted by it, but many people lost their jobs. Many people have not gotten their jobs back. Many people, if they did go to work, were put at physical risk to do that. So we start with that basic idea of the impact varied. We also know the health exposure varied by socioeconomics, by race and other factors, and of course by age. The government played a positive role and some negative roles. Here in New York, thousands and thousands of people died in nursing homes. And there were definitely things that were done wrong. Absolutely. But there's lawsuit protection here in New York. Those nursing homes will not ever be sued successfully and lose money due to a COVID death. Now we can ask why that is, and I think that's a separate conversation, but it just reminds us that all lives are not valued equally. The elderly people who are in those nursing homes who died, their families will not be provided any financial compensation. So there's another question that comes up related to COVID, which is, were the shutdowns worth it? All right, that's a tough question to answer. Clearly, there's a trade-off of economics and health risk. And I mentioned that the regulatory agencies do these calculations all the time, but, and here's the big but, regulatory agencies do calculations like this, cost-benefit analysis, on much more clearly understood scientific questions and problems. If I raise the arsenic in the water, what is the health impact? Well, I've got decades of data on that. And the cost implications are very clear. I can understand that, I can estimate it. I might be off by a factor of 20, 30%, but that's okay. Versus COVID, where in theory, the regulatory agencies might be able to do some type of a calculation of the trade-offs between shutdowns and lives saved. But the science isn't well enough established for them to have done that. I don't think they had the numbers. That said, if you look at the order of magnitude of the risk, that is, how many people were at risk of dying had no action been taken, and the impact on the economy, it actually comes out to exactly what you would expect if you had used the regulatory input value of $10 million per life. So the impact on the economy and the associated lives saved, it actually comes out roughly what you would have expected had they actually ran the calculation with the expected number of deaths for COVID had there been no action taken. Of course, that alternative, that counterfactual, would not exist. Every government in the world was going to do something. Let me take another one. I agree that more value creates a greater incentive for a company to focus on safety, specifically having a higher price for human life in a settlement. But where does this stop? $20 million in Toyota seems pretty high. What do you think would be the result if it were 10 times that figure? Okay, that's a great question. If it were that high, let's say Toyota has to pay a fine of $200 million per preventable death. There'll be a lot less car companies. The cost of the cars will increase dramatically because companies will have to invest so much more in safety that they will sell substantially less cars at a much, much higher price. And no exaggeration, there'll be a lot less car companies. So there is this trade-off when we talk about for-profit companies as well and the regulatory agencies involved. All right, so the value of a statistical life, that $10 million, it was meant for unidentified lives. It was meant for regulatory agencies. Some people say that that 10 million number should be used in these types of calculations as well. If it did, then you would still see really strong incentives for companies to invest in safety. But I think, to your point, and I'm directing this over to Bruce, who raised it, if they made that value 10 times higher, it would have devastating impact on the car industry. It would wipe out so much of the car industry. I see another question here. One of them is, are the disputes about the value of human life decided only by judges? So civil courts judgments, you can have a jury involved, it can be a judge decision, or you can go to arbitration. There are different ways that it can be decided. In the famous example of the Ford Pinto case, it was, I believe it was a civil court judgment where Ford Pinto had used as an input value in their calculation that the cost of a preventable death, this is back in 1970, was about $200,000. They were using as their estimate at the time a lifetime income estimate. Well, when they lost their lawsuits were on the scale of millions of dollars per victim, different order of magnitude. So they had vastly underestimated what the cost was going to be. And in that particular case, it was specifically as a civil court judgment that it came out. Grimshaw versus, I think, Ford Pinto. I see another interesting comment that for many years, airlines did no computations for infants and young children, claiming lack of evidence either way. Has that changed in recent years? So I'm not certain what the answer is. I do know that airlines do pay compensation for loss of life, regardless of age. So maybe they don't do a computation. Maybe it's like the September of the Victims Compensation Fund, where there's a fixed price that they offer as compensation. But there is something. There are certainly areas to flesh out on it, but it is, if you're using income as a basis and someone is too young to work, you're always going to have that question. But my perspective on that is, let's try to avoid using income as a basis because of all the intrinsic issues and biases there. So we have time for one or two more questions if anyone wants to type it in. Otherwise, I can tell you about a different part of the book that's not part of my presentation. So why don't I tell you about that? So I mentioned how the September 11th Victims Compensation Fund first got me interested in how human life is valued, and then I encountered this very much in my professional expertise. But I first came face to face with this when looking at life insurance. Now, life insurance is probably everyone's most direct experience in how to value human life. In that particular case, there are calculations you can do. There's something called the replacement income calculation. So you ask, how much were you expecting to earn over the next years of your working life? How much money do you need to replace of that income? And that becomes what is your, what is the value of your life insurance policy? That's one approach. A second approach looks at what is the income that your survivors would need. It's called a survivor needs calculation. You might estimate how much that would cost. And so for the survivor needs calculation, you might estimate, let's say your dependents need $100,000 for the next 15 years, and then they're on their own. You would calculate it that way. And that tells you what your overall life insurance policy should be. But the most practical approach that most people do is they pick a number that feels good, some round number, 250, 500, 1 million, something like that. And they look at the affordability of the premium. And that's the major driving factors. That goes in, that's the experience with a calculation. How do you figure that out? And there you're putting a price tag on your own life. Now, interestingly, I think most of us know that in pretty much every country and in every state in the United States, women on average live longer lives than men, typically about 5 years longer. But there's one state in the United States where life insurance companies are not allowed to consider sex in their life tables. They have to charge men and women the same amount. And when they do that, what they're really doing is they're forcing women to subsidize the men in that state. This doesn't just happen in that case. Life insurance companies have data that very easily shows differences in life expectancy by race and by ethnicity, but they generally do not use it. So it's an interesting choice they make. In some states, they are allowed to. Is legally, they're allowed, it states in their law they can use race, but in general, life insurance companies usually do not use that information. Let me pause. I hope that inspired you. So I think we're almost done with our questions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to maybe wrap up a little bit early. I'll give it 30 more seconds. And then if there's no other questions, I'll thank everyone for their time. And I really appreciate you joining.
Well, we just want to thank you too, and thank everybody for coming to this event. Oh, I think we have one more question.
It's a thank you. Thank yous are always appreciated. Yeah. My pleasure. And this is Hopkins, so let me do a quick plug and just say, going to Hopkins was one of the best experiences of my life. I am so grateful for everything that the university did for me, and I'm always happy to connect with alums. So if you enjoyed the talk, found it interesting. I'm very active on LinkedIn. I post a lot of, sometimes intelligent things, sometimes maybe not so intelligent, but by all means, just feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm always happy to connect with my fellow Hopkins people there.
Well, thanks again, and thank you, everybody. I will follow up with you in an email with Howard's contact information on LinkedIn, and we hope we see you at more of our events. So thanks again for spending some of your day with us. Take care. Be safe.
Thank you. Goodbye.